It was just after dawn when the first squad car pulled into the parking lot of St. Matthew's Church, its flashing lights bouncing off stained glass that had not yet caught the morning sun. The officers had been called out on what they thought would be a routine welfare check. A parishioner had phoned in, shaken, saying the doors to the sanctuary were ajar and something felt wrong. What they found inside would haunt them for the rest of their careers. The scent of wax and iron clung heavy in the air. Candles, some still flickering, lined the aisle in uneven rows, their smoke rising like thin prayers to nowhere. In the center of the altar stood a massive wooden cross, freshly assembled, its crude nails hammered in place with violent urgency. And on that cross was the body of a woman, her head bowed forward, her wrists pierced, her dress torn, crimson stains spreading across the white fabric. For a moment, the scene didn't register as real. It looked more like a grotesque tableau stage for a medieval ritual. But it was real, horribly real. The woman was Elena Hale, the newlywed wife of Pastor Jonathan Hale. Just weeks earlier, she had stood in this very church in a lace gown, smiling shyly as vows were exchanged, the congregation erupting in applause. Now, she was displayed like an offering, turned into the centerpiece of a crime scene more shocking than any sermon could have imagined. Officers secured the sanctuary, radios crackling as the news traveled up the chain of command. Within an hour, detectives and crime scene technicians filled the church, snapping photos, bagging evidence, whispering to one another in disbelief. The sanctuary, once a place of comfort, had become a place of horror. People from the neighborhood gathered outside, some sobbing, some furious, others praying silently with their rosaries clutched tight. The name Jonathan Hale carried weight in this small Florida town. He was more than just a pastor. He was a moral figurehead, a man who preached every Sunday about righteousness, fidelity, and the dangers of modern sin. His voice carried conviction. His words often quoted at community meetings and town halls. For many, he had been the closest thing to a living embodiment of virtue, which is why the whispers that followed that morning spread so quickly, so viciously. Because Jonathan was not missing. He was not a victim. He was sitting quietly in a pew when the first officers arrived, his hands stained, his eyes fixed on the cross, as if in prayer. When asked what happened, his answer chilled even the most hardened detective. She lied to me. She lied to God, and I delivered his judgment. In the span of one night, the image of a model pastor collapsed into something monstrous, and the story of a marriage that once seemed like a blessing was now the beginning of one of Florida's most disturbing murder cases. The question that lingered in everyone's mind was simple, terrifying. How could a man so revered by his flock commit an act so barbaric within the very walls of his own church? Long before his name became synonymous with horror, Jonathan Hale was the kind of pastor small towns prayed for. Born and raised in northern Florida, the son of a carpenter and a Sunday school teacher, his childhood had all the makings of a wholesome American upbringing. Neighbors remembered a boy who mowed lawns for widows, carried groceries for the elderly, and volunteered to read scripture at youth services. By his teens, he was already seen as destined for the pulpit. He had the voice, one longtime congregant would later recall. Deep, steady, the kind that made you believe every word was carved in stone. By the time he reached his 40s, Hale had become a fixture in the community. St. Matthew's wasn't just his church, it was his kingdom. Attendance swelled under his leadership. Families filled the pews every Sunday. Teenagers joined the youth choir, and donations flowed into the collection plate. His sermons leaned hard into morality, the sanctity of marriage, the dangers of temptation, the confusion he said modern society had unleashed on gender and sexuality. He could be fiery from the pulpit, his fist pounding on the lectern, his voice echoing against stained glass. But outside of services, he was approachable, shaking hands with the same firmness he used to bless newborns and to console widows. To many, Jonathan Hale embodied the American dream of faith and discipline. He had lost his first wife to cancer years earlier, and the way he carried that grief only deepened the congregation's respect. He never complained, never faltered, Never let anyone see him lose control. Pastor Hale is what every man should strive to be, one deacon once said during a community banquet. He's a pillar, a true shepherd of the flock. His reputation stretched beyond the church. Local schools invited him to speak at assemblies about character and integrity. Police chiefs consulted him for chaplain services. Even local politicians sought his endorsement, knowing a kind word from Pastor Hale could sway entire neighborhoods. So when, after years of solitude, Hale appeared at church socials with a new companion on his arm, a graceful woman named Elena, people whispered, but in a warm way. They said it was good to see the pastor smile again. They remarked on how radiant she looked in the front row of Sunday service, how she nodded along to his sermons, how she brought baked goods to after-service gatherings. The couple quickly became a symbol of hope, proof that even after loss, love could bloom again. Their courtship seemed almost too perfect. Parishioners remembered seeing them walking hand in hand down the town square, stopping for coffee, laughing like teenagers. Hale, once so stoic, began sprinkling small personal anecdotes into his sermons, about cooking dinner together, about Elena's way of humming hymns while doing chores. It was the kind of wholesome picture that communities like this cling to. To the outside world, they were an inspiration. To Hale's flock, they were living testimony that God rewards patience and faith. The wedding itself was the event of the season. On a warm Saturday afternoon, St. Matthew's overflowed with guests, some standing in the aisles for lack of seats. Elena walked down the aisle in lace, her veil glowing in the filtered sunlight. Hale's voice trembled only once, when he said, "Till death do us part." The congregation erupted in applause. Cameras flashed, and the choir sang with a kind of force that felt like heaven itself had taken notice. It wasn't just a union of two people. It was a public restoration of Pastor Hale's narrative. For years, he had been the grieving widower. Now, he was a redeemed man, stepping into joy again, with a bride who seemed tailor-made to fit the role. Newspapers from nearby counties even ran small features. "Beloved pastor finds love again." The town basked in the glow of their happiness, seeing in their smiles a reflection of stability in an unstable world. Behind that glow, though, were hints, small, barely noticeable, that not everything was as flawless as it appeared. Elena rarely spoke of her past. When curious church ladies asked about her childhood or family, she would smile politely and redirect the conversation. She avoided the spotlight during community events, letting Hale take center stage. If anyone wondered, they chalked it up to modesty. After all, not everyone wanted to live under the microscope of a pastor's congregation. For Jonathan, those silences didn't bother him, at least not then. He presented Elena as his blessing, his answered prayer. From the pulpit, he talked about second chances, about God's ability to heal what was broken and make it whole again. And the congregation believed him. Why wouldn't they? Everything about their union seemed ordained. No one could have imagined that beneath that perfect exterior lay a secret powerful enough to dismantle not just a marriage, but an entire community's faith in the man they trusted most. For months after the wedding, life at St. Matthew's seemed almost idyllic. Pastor Hale's sermons were infused with a new energy, as though marriage had restored not only his personal life, but his spiritual calling. Elena was always at his side, reserved but radiant, the perfect pastor's wife. The congregation embraced her with open arms, though many admitted later that they didn't really know her. She carried herself with poise, always polite, always kind, but careful never to reveal too much about where she came from or who she used to be. When questions arose about her childhood, about families still living, about why no relatives appeared at the wedding, Elena had a way of brushing them aside with a soft smile. "It's a long story," she would say, or, "I've been blessed to find my true family here." For a community that was trained to see the pastor as infallible, those answers were enough. If she was good enough for him, she was good enough for everyone else. But behind the walls of the parsonage, Elena carried a secret that weighed heavier than any Bible in the church. Years earlier, long before she met Hale, she had undergone gender reassignment surgery. She had been born Michael, a fact she had spent decades quietly burying, first under layers of shame in a conservative household, then through the long, painful process of becoming the woman she always knew she was. To her, Elena wasn't a mask, it was her truth. But it was a truth she dared not share in this small Florida town, especially not with a man like Jonathan Hale. He was a pastor who preached that God created man and woman as distinct, unchangeable roles. He railed against what he called modern confusion, warning parents to guard their children against it. Elena had heard his words long before she ever accepted his proposal, but she convinced herself that love could soften him, that once he truly knew her, perhaps she could bridge that chasm between doctrine and reality. Still, fear kept her silent. Each time she thought about telling him, she imagined his face hardening, his voice rising, his entire world collapsing. And so she stayed quiet. In private moments, she was meticulous. Medical records, old IDs, and photographs from her early life were locked away in a cedar box tucked in the back of a closet. When Hale asked about scars, lines faintly visible along her abdomen, she explained them away as old surgeries. He never pressed further. Perhaps he didn't want to. He was too wrapped up in the image of redemption their marriage offered, too eager to show the world that he had been made whole again. Yet there were cracks in the facade. Elena often avoided intimacy, complaining of fatigue or headaches. On nights when Hale reached for her, she sometimes tensed, fearing discovery. Friends noticed she was more comfortable in group settings than alone with her husband, as though the presence of others provided cover. One congregant recalled seeing her sitting in the back pew late at night, weeping quietly, though she quickly brushed it off as stress. Still, the longer the secret lingered, the more dangerous it became. Elena wasn't just hiding her past from a husband. She was hiding it from a man whose very identity was bound up in moral certainty. Every sermon he delivered against deception cut her deeper. Every time he warned about wolves in sheep's clothing, she felt her chest tighten. And yet she said nothing, because in her mind, confession would destroy everything: the church, his reputation, their marriage. She believed silence was the only way to survive. But silence has a way of turning into a noose, tightening with every passing day. And when the truth finally broke loose, it did so with a force neither of them could control. The night it all unraveled began like any other. A humid Florida evening pressed against the windows of the parsonage, cicadas droning in the trees. Jonathan Hale had just finished his notes for Sunday's sermon, a thunderous message on purity and truth, and he was in an oddly buoyant mood. Elena moved through the house quietly, folding laundry, setting aside clothes for the morning. To anyone looking in, it was a picture of domestic calm. But inside Elena's chest, the silence was suffocating. She had felt it tightening for weeks, the dread that her secret could not stay hidden forever. That evening, Hale poured himself a small glass of bourbon, something he only allowed in private, and joined Elena in the living room. He spoke of how blessed he felt, how their marriage had restored his faith in God's timing. She smiled faintly, nodding, but the words lodged in her throat. Each affirmation felt like a blade. She thought about the cedar box upstairs, the locked drawer where she kept the remnants of her past. Maybe she thought it was time to tell him. Maybe she could trust love to outweigh dogma. But the moment slipped into something far darker. Later that night, when they went to bed, Hale reached for her with unusual tenderness. At first, she yielded, telling herself she could manage, but his hands explored further, seeking intimacy she often deflected. This time, there was no excuse ready, no illness to claim. His persistence met her resistance, and in that charged silence, his hand brushed against something he hadn't expected, evidence of scars, of a body altered by surgery. He froze. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the hum of the ceiling fan. Then his breathing shifted, heavy, uneven. "What is this?" His voice cracked like a whip, more accusation than question. Elena's eyes widened. Her heart hammered. She tried to speak, to explain, but the words stumbled out in fragments. "Please, Jonathan. I should have told you. I was—" Before she could finish, he recoiled as if struck. He stumbled out of bed, pacing like a caged animal, muttering scripture under his breath. An abomination, a deceit, a lie before God. Elena sat trembling, clutching the sheet to her chest, pleading for him to listen. I am your wife. I am the woman you married. I love you. But the words only fanned his fury. To a man who had built his entire identity on rigid moral lines, her revelation was not just betrayal. It was blasphemy. Hale stormed into his study, yanking a Bible from the shelf, flipping pages with shaking hands. He shouted verses about sin, deception, the wages of immorality. Elena followed him, tears streaking her face, begging him to stop, to hear her truth. I'm not your enemy, Jonathan. I am still me. Something in his eyes hardened then, a flicker of zealotry overtaking reason. He slammed the Bible shut and whispered words that chilled her. If you lied to me, you lied to God. And God demands judgment. What followed was a blur of violence and ritual. He dragged her from the house, ignoring her screams, forcing her across the short walk to the church. The night air was thick, the moon casting pale light on the steeple that loomed above them. In the center aisle, a large wooden cross had been stored for Easter pageants. Hale seized it, slamming it upright against the altar. Elena's cries turned to desperate sobs. Please, Jonathan, this isn't God's will. This is madness. But he no longer heard her. To him, he was no longer a husband. He was an instrument of divine retribution. He bound her wrists with rope from the utility closet, hoisting her against the cross. She writhed, begging him to stop, but he pressed forward. At one point, she whispered through tears, I forgive you, but the words barely reached him. His face was set, eyes glazed, as though he had already left the realm of reason. When it was done, he stepped back, panting, staring at what he had created. His wife transformed into a grotesque icon, suspended between life and death. Hale sank into a pew, Bible clutched to his chest, and began to pray. Not for forgiveness, but for vindication. She lied to me. She lied to you. And I have done your will. Hours later, as dawn began to seep through stained glass, he was still there, kneeling, hands stained red, whispering scripture to the silent body on the cross. To him, the night had been holy. To the rest of the world, it would be remembered as one of Florida's most horrifying acts of faith twisted into murder. The sanctuary of St. Matthew's had always been a place of warmth. Hymns rising against stained glass, children fidgeting in pews while their parents bowed their heads in prayer. But on that night, under flickering candlelight and the madness of one man's conviction, it was transformed into a chamber of terror. Every sound was amplified. The creak of wood, the metallic ring of nails against a hammer, the desperate, muffled cries of a woman whose life was being sacrificed in the name of a lie she never meant to live. Jonathan Hale moved with a terrifying calm, as if every gesture were rehearsed. He had dragged the wooden cross from storage, propping it against the altar so it loomed like a judgment waiting to be passed. His hands, calloused from years of carpentry and pastoral work, trembled only slightly as he fastened the ropes around Elena's wrists. She fought, pleading, her voice echoing through the empty church, but he was stronger, his body fueled by a frenzy she couldn't match. The ropes cut into her skin as he pulled them tight, stretching her arms wide across the rough wood. She twisted, begging for mercy, calling his name not as an adversary, but as a husband. Jonathan, please. I am still your wife. I am still me. But the words slid off him like water over stone. His lips moved constantly, muttering scripture, as though he were drowning out her humanity with the cadence of holy verse. When a hammer rose, the sanctuary seemed to hold its breath. The first strike rang out like a gunshot, a brutal metallic crack that vibrated against the walls. Elena screamed, her voice shredding into raw sound as the nail bit into flesh. Blood welled and ran down her arm, dripping onto the polished wood floor. He struck again, the hammer coming down with the rhythm of a man possessed. Each blow was deliberate, methodical. To Hale, this wasn't violence. It was ritual, a grotesque liturgy meant to purge sin. Candles flickered violently with the rush of air stirred by his movements. Their shadows twisted along the walls, casting monstrous silhouettes of cross, hammer, and writhing body. The air grew thick, heavy with the mingled scents of wax, sweat, and blood. Elena's cries weakened, shifting into hoarse whimpers, but she never stopped begging. God does not want this. You are killing me, not saving me. For a fleeting moment, his hand faltered. The words pierced through his mania, and he stared into her tear-streaked face. In another life, in another version of this night, perhaps love might have broken through. But then his jaw clenched, and he shook his head violently, forcing the doubt away. You deceived me. You deceived God. I cannot be deceived. He nailed her feet last, pinning her to the wood with a grunt of exertion. The sound was sickening, the kind of wet crack that makes even seasoned detectives wince years later when recalling the scene. Elena's body sagged against the ropes, her chest heaving as she struggled for air. Above her head, Hale scrawled a message in black marker across the crossbeam. Judgment belongs to the Lord. It was his signature, his attempt to turn murder into divine decree. When the final blow was struck and the hammer clattered to the floor, silence fell heavy in the church. The only sounds were Elena's ragged breaths and the slow drip of blood onto tile. Hale stepped back, chest rising and falling, his eyes glazed as if he had slipped fully into another reality. He looked at her not as a wife, not even as a victim, but as an offering. Elena lifted her head weakly. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried enough strength to echo through the hollow space. I forgive you. Her words trembled, fragile but resolute, the final act of defiance against the cruelty inflicted upon her. Hale's face twisted, pain, rage, perhaps even shame flickered across his features. But then it hardened again into cold resolve. He sank into a pew, folded his blood-stained hands, and bowed his head. Minutes bled into hours. The candles burned low, their wax pooling on the floor, their smoke curling upward like restless spirits. Outside, the town slept, unaware that its shepherd had turned sanctuary into execution ground. Inside, Hale prayed, rocking back and forth, whispering to a God who would never answer. He spoke of betrayal, of purity, of judgment. He spoke as though he were both priest and executioner, blind to the horror that he had unleashed. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through the stained glass, Elena was gone. Her body hung limp, her blood dried in dark streaks down the wood. The church smelled of death and wax, a grotesque mingling of the sacred and the profane. And there, still in the front pew, Pastor Hale sat slumped with his Bible open on his lap, lips moving silently, not in remorse, not in confusion, but in the unshakable belief that what he had done was righteous. When the doors finally opened hours later, when parishioners and police would see the scene for themselves, the horror would ripple outward through the town, through the state, through the nation. But for now, in that stillness, the church bore witness to a crime that blurred the line between faith and madness, and left only a crucifixion where there once had been a marriage. The morning sun had barely crested over the palms when the first parishioner arrived at St. Matthew's. Mrs. Jenkins, a woman who had opened the church every Saturday for 40 years, noticed the detail immediately. The heavy oak doors, normally locked tight overnight, were ajar. She frowned, clutching her Bible closer to her chest. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Maybe the pastor had returned late from his study and forgotten to lock up. But as she stepped onto the threshold, a chill ran down her spine. The air inside was wrong. It wasn't the familiar scent of polished wood and hymnals. It was heavy, metallic, mixed with candle smoke. Her eyes adjusted to the dimness, and then she saw it, the outline of something massive in the center aisle, framed by flickering candles. She screamed, the sound splitting the stillness of the sanctuary, and staggered backward out the doors. Her call to 911 was panicked, words tumbling over each other. There's blood. There's something in the church. You need to come now. Within minutes, the first patrol car rolled up. Officers stepped inside cautiously, their radios crackling. What they found stopped them cold. At the altar, looming like some grotesque centerpiece, was the cross. And on it, Elena Hale's body, her head slumped forward, her dress stiff with dried blood. One officer gagged and turned away, pressing a hand to his mouth. Another whispered, "Dear God," though there was nothing reverent in his tone. Crime scene tape went up quickly, but word traveled faster than the detectives could move. Neighbors gathered outside, craning their necks, murmuring prayers, clutching each other in disbelief. St. Matthew's had always been their sanctuary, their refuge. Now, its stained glass windows glowed with the first rays of morning light, illuminating horror inside. Detective Carla Hughes was among the first investigators to arrive. A seasoned officer, she had seen her share of brutal cases, but nothing like this. The moment she stepped into the sanctuary, she felt her stomach tighten. It wasn't just murder. It was theater, ritual, a deliberate display meant to shock. She moved slowly down the aisle, eyes sweeping over details, the hammer discarded near the altar, the ropes cutting into Elena's wrists, the words scrawled above her head. Judgment belongs to the Lord. Carla crouched near the base of the cross, examining blood patterns. This wasn't fast, she muttered, her voice low, meant only for the technician beside her. He wanted her to suffer. The tech nodded grimly, snapping photographs. And then, the most chilling detail, sitting in the front pew, as though nothing were amiss, was Pastor Jonathan Hale himself. His hands were stained, his eyes fixed on the body before him. When officers approached, he didn't resist. He didn't run. He simply turned his gaze, calm and almost serene, and said, "She deceived me. She deceived God. I carried out his will." The words sent a shiver through the room. Officers exchanged glances, unsure if they were dealing with a murderer, a madman, or both. Hale was cuffed without struggle, escorted past the horrified congregation now gathered outside. Gasps and shouts erupted as their beloved pastor appeared in chains, his shirt still marked with blood. Some cried out in anger, others in disbelief. A few even knelt to pray, as if unable to reconcile the image of their spiritual leader with the crime unfolding before them. Inside, the investigation began in earnest. Forensic teams cataloged every detail, the positioning of the body, the makeshift altar, the scattered pages of scripture. Outside, television vans pulled up, reporters scrambling to capture the story. By noon, the murder at St. Matthew's was no longer a local tragedy. It was a statewide headline, soon to be a national scandal. And at the center of it all was one haunting truth. The sanctuary had been turned into a killing ground, and the man sworn to guide his flock had become the executioner. Detective Carla Hughes had investigated homicides before, domestic disputes gone wrong, bar fights that escalated, even the occasional premeditated killing, but nothing like this. The moment she stepped into St. Matthew's and saw Elena Hale nailed to the cross, she knew this was not just a crime. It was a message, and unraveling that message would require peeling back the layers of a man who had once been the town's moral compass. The first step was to secure the scene. Technicians moved slowly, photographing every angle of the sanctuary. Blood spatter was mapped out, rope fibers were bagged, and the hammer, its handle slick with sweat and prints, was sealed in evidence. Carla's eyes lingered on the scrawled words above the body. Judgment belongs to the Lord. The handwriting was jagged, rushed, but there was no doubt whose hand had written it. "This is his signature," she muttered. He wanted everyone to know this wasn't random. It was intentional. At the station, Pastor Hale was booked without resistance. He sat quietly, quoting scripture and insisting he had acted under God's will. To him, it was not murder, but correction. Over the next hours, his statements painted a portrait of a man who saw himself not as a murderer, but as a divine instrument. He quoted scripture incessantly, often out of context, using verses as justification. Better to pluck out the eye that offends, better to cut off the hand that sins. She was a deception detective. I was chosen to reveal the truth. Carla pressed him about premeditation, about the cross, the ropes, the hammer. He insisted it was all provided by God's will, though investigators later confirmed he had dragged the cross into place hours before the murder, candles arranged with ritualistic precision. Meanwhile, the forensic evidence told its own story. Dr. Elaine Chun, the county medical examiner, examined Elena's body with grim precision. Defensive wounds along her wrists and forearms showed she had struggled desperately. Bruising around her shoulders suggested she had been dragged across rough flooring before being bound. The fatal injuries were the nails driven into her wrists and feet, which caused massive blood loss and shock. This was slow, deliberate, Dr. Chin testified in her preliminary report. She remained alive for an extended period after the initial injuries. Whoever did this intended for her to suffer. Detectives also uncovered the cedar box hidden in the parsonage closet. Inside were medical records, photographs, and documents from Elena's life before her transition. The discovery reframed everything. The motive, once obscured, became clear. Hale had discovered his wife's past and, in his mind, turned it into a justification for murder. Carla studied the contents of the box late into the night, shaking her head. She lived in fear of this moment, she said to a colleague, and it found her anyway. Interviews with church members revealed the deep fracture beginning to spread through the community. Some refused to believe their pastor capable of such an act, insisting there had to be some mistake. Others, horrified, described Elena as a kind, gentle woman who never sought the spotlight. A few, disturbingly, whispered that maybe the pastor had acted under righteous anger. The division was as sharp as the crime itself. Carla focused on building a case that would strip away any veneer of divine purpose and reveal the cold mechanics of murder. She reconstructed the timeline. Hale and Elena at home, the confrontation in their bedroom, the forced march to the church, the staging of the cross, the ritual killing. Surveillance cameras from nearby streets caught glimpses of Hale leading Elena across the churchyard in the dead of night. Neighbors recalled hearing distant cries, but dismissing them as arguments carried on the wind. In one crucial breakthrough, crime lab analysis revealed Hale's fingerprints not only on the hammer and ropes, but also on the lid of the cedar box. The prosecution would later argue this proved he had discovered Elena's secret before the murder, giving him motive and eliminating any claim of sudden shock. He knew. Carla told the district attorney, ADA Carlin Nguyen. And once he knew, he decided to turn his rage into a sermon written in blood. When confronted with the box in interrogation, Hale didn't deny it. Instead, he lifted his chin and said, "The truth was placed before me. I cannot ignore it." For Carla, it was the final confirmation. This was premeditated, born not of madness alone, but of choice. The investigation stretched over weeks, each day peeling back another layer of hypocrisy. Parishioners delivered testimonies about Hale's fiery sermons condemning falsehoods of the flesh. Journalists dug through archives, unearthing past statements where he railed against LGBTQ communities. Every detail painted the portrait of a man whose public morality masked a private fragility, one that cracked the moment he faced a truth he couldn't reconcile. By the time the investigation closed and charges were filed, the case against Pastor Hale was airtight. First-degree murder, kidnapping, aggravated assault. The evidence was overwhelming. The body displayed like a grotesque sermon, the forensic trail linking him to every action, his own chilling words recorded in interrogation. For Detective Carla Hughes, it was both a victory and a wound. She had secured justice for Elena, but the image of that sanctuary, the cross, the blood, the whispered forgiveness of a dying woman, would follow her long after the trial ended. And for the town of St. Matthews, the investigation had done more than expose a crime. It had shattered faith in the man they once called Shepherd, leaving them to reckon with a question no one could easily answer. How does a community rebuild when its holiest place becomes a crime scene and its pastor the killer? The trial of Pastor Jonathan Hale began on a sweltering Monday morning, and by sunrise the courthouse steps were already a circus. News vans lined the street, satellite dishes pointed skyward, reporters jostling for position while locals gathered with homemade signs. Some signs bore Elena's name in bold letters, "Justice for Elena," while others defended the disgraced pastor, quoting scripture about forgiveness and judgment. The divide outside was only a glimpse of the storm that would rage inside. Inside the packed courtroom, every seat was filled, and an overflow room had to be set up with live video. Judge Leonard Harlow presided from a bench, his face stern, the gavel striking sharply to bring order. The defendant sat at the defense table in a neatly pressed suit, his hands folded, a Bible close at hand. If he felt the weight of the moment, he didn't show it. His eyes remained fixed on the cross that hung above the judge's chair, as if seeking reassurance. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Carlin Gwynn, a woman known for her sharp questioning and unflinching delivery. In her opening statement, she didn't waste time. She painted a vivid picture of the crime. The defendant, Pastor Jonathan Hale, did not act out of sudden rage. He acted out of calculation. He dragged his wife into the very sanctuary meant to be a place of refuge, bound her to a cross, and turned her death into a grotesque sermon. Her voice was steady, each word punctuated with precision. She held up photographs of the crime scene, so graphic that some jurors visibly recoiled. This was not justice. This was not God's will. This was murder, deliberate and cruel. The defense, led by attorney Samuel Breyer, countered with a very different framing. Breyer's voice was calm, measured, almost soothing. Ladies and gentlemen, you will hear about a man who discovered, in one shocking instant, that the foundation of his marriage was built on lies. He was a man of faith, yes, but also a man of flesh and blood. He experienced betrayal so profound, so unimaginable, that it shattered his mind. This was not premeditation. This was not calculated evil. This was a crime of passion, born of trauma. He gestured toward Hale. What you see before you is not a monster, but a broken man who lost control. The prosecution's case unfolded with grim detail. Detective Carla Hughes took the stand, walking the jury through the timeline. The discovery of Elena's medical records, the confrontation, the forced march to the church. She described arriving at the scene, the cross, the blood, the chilling words Hale offered upon arrest. She deceived me. She deceived God. I carried out his will. Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes hardened as she recounted it. Next came the forensic testimony of Dr. Elaine Shen. With clinical precision, she explained Elena's injuries, the nail wounds, the defensive bruises, the slow, agonizing nature of her death. Charts and photographs backed her words. This was not instantaneous, she told the jury. She remained conscious for a significant period, suffering immensely. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. One juror covered her mouth, fighting back tears. Perhaps the most damning evidence came from the cedar box found in the parsonage. The prosecution displayed its contents, documents, photographs, medical records, arguing that Hale had discovered the truth about Elena's past before the night of the murder. Fingerprint analysis confirmed his touch. This proves knowledge, A.D. Nguyen emphasized. This proves motive. This was not shock. This was decision. The defense did its best to chip away. Cross-examining Dr. Chun, Breyer suggested Hale's actions might have been those of a man in psychosis, unable to distinguish reality from delusion. With Detective Hughes, he pressed on whether Hale had shown signs of mental instability at the scene. Carla stood firm. He knew exactly what he was doing. He staged it. He wrote his message above her body. The defense also called parishioners to the stand, loyal congregants who spoke of Hale's character, his devotion, his years of service. They painted him as compassionate, disciplined, a man who had counseled countless marriages, donated to the needy, stood vigil at hospital bedsides. This is not the man I know, one elderly deacon testified, shaking his head. But under cross-examination, A.D. Nguyen reminded the jury that goodness in the past does not erase murder in the present. Then came a most anticipated moment. Jonathan Hale himself taking the stand. Against his lawyer's advice, he insisted on testifying. The courtroom fell silent as he adjusted the microphone, Bible in hand. His voice was calm, even soothing at times, as he described the night of the murder. "I discovered the truth," he said. "She was not who she claimed to be. She stood before me as deception made flesh. I prayed, and God gave me clarity. I did not kill her out of hate. I purified a lie." His words, delivered with chilling conviction, landed like stones in the hushed room. And Wynn's cross-examination was relentless. "Pastor Hale, you claim this was not premeditated. But why did you drag the cross into the sanctuary hours before? Why did you arrange candles? Why did you write that message above her head?" Hale paused, then said simply, "Because God commanded it." Wynn leaned forward, her voice sharp. "No, Pastor. You commanded it. You decided. And a woman died in agony because of you." By the time both sides rested, the jury was left with two stark portraits: a cold-blooded murderer who staged a ritual killing, or a man broken by betrayal who lost his mind in a storm of religious zeal. Outside the courthouse, the divide deepened. Vigils for Elena were held, candles flickering against posters reading "Love is not a lie." Across the street, Hale's supporters prayed loudly, some shouting that he was a prophet persecuted for his faith. Hashtag spread online. Hashtag justice for Elena. Hashtag pray for pastor. Hashtag faith or murder. National news outlets covered every detail, each headline more sensational than the last. Inside, the jury deliberated for days. They pored over photographs, testimony, transcripts. The weight of the decision pressed down on them, knowing the eyes of a nation were watching. When the verdict finally came, the tension in the courtroom was electric. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised, cameras ready. The foreperson stood, voice steady. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Jonathan Hale, guilty of murder in the first degree." Gasps erupted, a mix of relief, rage, and grief. Hale sat motionless, eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. Judge Harlow wasted no time. "For the crime of first-degree murder, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." The gavel struck, echoing like a final nail. And just like that, the shepherd of St. Matthew's was condemned, not to the flames of hell he so often preached about, but to a cell where his sermons would find no audience but the silence of his own conscience. The day of sentencing drew an even larger crowd than the trial itself. By dawn, the courthouse steps were jammed with protesters, mourners, and curious onlookers. Reporters shouted into microphones as television crews jockeyed for angles. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, charged, as if the walls themselves understood the gravity of what was about to happen. Pastor Jonathan Hale was led into the courtroom in shackles. Gone was the polished suit and crisp tie. He now wore the plain beige uniform of the county jail. Even so, he carried himself with the same rigid posture, Bible tucked under one arm, eyes fixed forward as though he were walking toward a pulpit instead of judgment. Some in the gallery bowed their heads, still loyal to him. Others glared openly, faces tight with rage. Judge Leonard Harlow entered and took his seat, gavel striking sharply. "We are here for sentencing in the matter of the state of Florida versus Jonathan Hale." The words hung in the air like a final drum roll. The prosecution made one last statement. ADA Carling Wynn rose, her tone steady but fierce. "Your Honor, this crime was more than murder. It was a desecration. The defendant twisted faith into a weapon and turned a place of worship into a killing ground. The community deserves closure. The victim deserves justice." The defense countered with a plea for mercy, arguing again that Hale had acted under psychological duress, that his life had once been a pillar of service. But the words felt hollow now, drowned out by the photographs burned into everyone's memory. Elena nailed to the cross, her face contorted in pain, her body turned into a symbol of fanaticism. When it was Hale's turn to speak, he stood slowly, Bible in hand. His voice was calm, even serene. "I have no remorse," he said. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. "I acted as God's servant. She deceived me. She deceived all of you. One day, you'll understand. He sat back down, lips moving in silent prayer. Judge Harlow's face hardened. He leaned forward, his voice cutting through the room. This court does not judge faith, Pastor Hale. It judges actions. And your actions were deliberate, cruel, and beyond justification. You did not act as God's servant. You acted as a murderer. He paused, letting the words settle. For the crime of first-degree murder, I sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The gavel came down like thunder. In the gallery, Elena's supporters wept openly, some hugging each other, whispering that justice had finally been served. Across the aisle, a handful of Hale's loyal parishioners sobbed, shaking their heads, murmuring prayers for his soul. The divide was as raw as it had been on the courthouse steps, two versions of truth clashing in one room. As deputies led Hale away, chains clinking, he lifted his chin, eyes still fixed on the cross above the judge's bench. For a moment, it almost looked as if he smiled. Then the doors closed behind him, and the man once hailed as a shepherd of faith disappeared into the system as just another inmate serving life. The courtroom emptied slowly, people stepping out into the blazing Florida sun. But the echoes of the gavel and the image of a pastor unrepentant lingered, a reminder that justice had been served. Yet peace would be far harder to find. In the weeks after the sentencing, the town of St. Matthews felt like it was living under a shadow. The church that had once been the community's heartbeat was now cordoned off with yellow tape, its stained glass windows shuttered, its doors locked tight. Parishioners who used to gather for Sunday worship now drove past in silence, unable to look directly at the building without seeing blood on the altar in their minds. The very place that had symbolized refuge and redemption was tainted, forever marked as the scene of a crucifixion no sermon could cleanse. The community split in two. On one side were those who mourned Elena, holding vigils on the courthouse lawn and at the edge of the churchyard. They lit candles, held up her picture, and repeated her name aloud so it would not be forgotten. They spoke of her kindness, her quiet presence, the way she had tried to fit into a town that never truly knew her. LGBTQ+ advocates from across Florida joined them, carrying banners that read "Love is truth and justice for Elena." For them, her death was more than a murder. It was a symbol of the violence that secrecy, shame, and fanaticism can create. On the other side were Hale's defenders, a smaller but louder group that refused to let go of the man they had called their shepherd. They insisted the verdict was unjust, that their pastor had been pushed past the brink by betrayal. Some called him a martyr. Others framed the trial as an attack on faith itself. They gathered in parking lots to pray for him, sometimes within sight of those holding candles for Elena. The two groups rarely clashed outright, but the tension was thick, like a wound the town couldn't stop reopening. The media frenzy did not fade quickly. National outlets ran specials titled "The Crucifixion Murder," dissecting every angle, every sermon, every testimony. Talk shows debated whether Hale was a monster or a man broken by shock. Hashtags continued to trend. Hashtag Justice for Elena. Hashtag Pray for Pastor. Each one a digital battlefield of ideology and outrage. For weeks, St. Matthews became shorthand for fanaticism gone too far, another cautionary tale in the long list of American tragedies. Meanwhile, Elena's family, who had stayed mostly silent through the proceedings, organized a memorial service in her hometown. Hundreds attended, some traveling from across the state. Friends spoke of her resilience, her courage in living as her true self despite fear. The service ended with the release of white doves, their wings cutting through the sky in stark contrast to the darkness of her final hours. For many, it was the first time Elena's story was told not as a crime, but as a life worth celebrating. As for the church itself, it never reopened. The diocese quietly dissolved the congregation, citing irreparable harm. Weeks later, vandals scrawled words across its doors, "Never again." Plans circulated to tear the building down and replace it with a memorial garden in Elena's name. Some welcomed the idea. Others, still loyal to Hale, called it sacrilege. Detective Carla Hughes carried the case with her long after the trial ended. In interviews, she admitted the image of Elena on the cross still haunted her sleep. It wasn't just murder, she said. It was betrayal, weaponized faith, and cruelty dressed up as holiness. I'll never forget it. ADA Carla Nguyen echoed the sentiment, telling reporters, "Justice was served, but justice doesn't heal." What happened here is going to leave scars on this community for a long time. In the end, the legacy of the case was not just one man's fall from grace, but the question it left behind. How do you reconcile love, faith, and truth when secrets are buried under fear? For the people of St. Matthew's, there was no easy answer. There was only the silence of an empty church, the flicker of vigil candles, and the memory of a woman who had once believed she could find safety in love, and instead found her death nailed to a cross.